You're watching the Letterman podcast with Mike Chisholm, endorsed by the Hello Deli.
Yeah.
La, la, la.
Welcome once again to the Letterman podcast. My name is Mike Chisholm. This is a fun episode. We focus on Merv Griffin, Johnny Carson, David Letterman, but a big part of it, Merv Griffin. Steve Randisi is our guest today. He is the author of Merv Griffin, The Inside Story. And this is a guy who, boy, for the small, resilient handful that are still with us, listening or watching, this is one of our people. My gosh, Steve is, actually we have this on the, we talk about this in the context of community members from the Letterman podcast. Adam Needef to game shows is to, Scott Ryan, David Lynch aficionado, of course, Adam Unger, Warren Zevon, official historian. Okay, well, Steve Randisi is that to Merv Griffin, and written a book about it, and just dozens and dozens and dozens of anecdotes. And we go down the path comparing, talking about the Johnny and Dave comparisons, Johnny and Merv comparison, Merv and Dave comparisons, lots of that, lots of cool, very cool inside stories. And shouldn't bury the lead, we now have confirmation as to where David Letterman's double eraser pencil came from. I might be the biggest moron in the whole world. Maybe a lot of people knew this, but I don't think I am. A lot of people don't know. And we now know where this came from. It was a tribute to Johnny Carson. And we're going to talk about that in this episode. Yeah, you know what? Let's just get to it. Steve Randisi, fantastic historian of Merv Griffin and many, many other things. He's got two other books out, and then one on the way. And just a fantastic guy. Enjoy. All right, Steve. Ever since I found out about your existence and we had our couple of conversations here, you and I can go and go and go and go. Here is the first question I have for you. Merv Griffin, do you think that in the in our culture, do you think he is underrated for his contributions to what he has done in entertainment and business?
Well, he's underrated with it's a generational thing. There are boundaries of time when it comes to the audience. A lot of younger people don't know who he was, and what he accomplished.
Yeah.
I mean, he was certainly revered, during his time. And then when you point out to people that, two of the shows that you watch every night, just before prime time, you have Jeopardy!
Mm-hmm.
And Wheel of Fortune.
Mm-hmm.
Those are his creations. So he left a lasting impression, on the television industry. So, but like I say, there's a generational thing. I don't think people of a certain demographic would be too familiar with him.
Yeah.
Unless there are people like us who are into this and they study, what came before.
Yeah.
A lot of them, unfortunately, are not even familiar with Johnny Carson.
That's actually one of the reasons why I started the show, is because here you have somebody who is the biggest star in the world at that point, him right. And Frank Sinatra. And I mean, Elizabeth Taylor, maybe. I mean, there aren't very many that could be kind of put into that echelon. And here you have, and again, who inspired many of the people who are still in the limelight right now. You look at a guy like Conan O'Brien. I mean, he inspired significantly by Johnny, and they don't know who Johnny Carson is. Now I go back. Okay, so we know that Johnny Carson was the biggest star in the world at that point. In my view, I mean, like, Merv Griffin did more shows than Johnny Carson did. He over, I think he is actually even approaching Letterman. I think him and Letterman are both very close to total shows. But you don't hear Merv mentioned the way that you hear Johnny mentioned.
Well, there's two reasons for that. Number one, they don't rerun Merv that often. MeTV was running his shows briefly a few years ago. I think over the summer of, I think it was 2015 or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And Merv is on DVD, as is Johnny, but you get Johnny 6 nights a week on Antenna TV. And then you have certain streaming channels where he's on 24/7.
Yep.
So he still has that tremendous exposure which Merv Griffin doesn't have. And then the other thing is you have to remember is that Merv Griffin, his talk show, he was on 23 years.
Yeah.
And his show went off the air in 1986.
Yep.
And the millennials that's before their time, you know.
Yeah, even Carson lasted till 92 or whatever it was, 91, 92.
Right.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. And also the other thing about let's get into this right away. Something that I feel so bad for my friend Dick Cavett about. Of course, Johnny Carson and Merv Griffin, of course, fell into this as well. Many of his shows, a huge portion of his shows, were lost completely.
Well, the first 10 years of Johnny from 62 to 72
are
no longer extant. But you have from 72 on. Merv has quite a few from the 60s. His Westinghouse, his syndicated Westinghouse show is largely available. And that's what's on the DVD set that you could get. You know, you mentioned Dick Cavett. Did you know that he wrote for Jack Parr?
Yes.
He wrote for Merv Griffin.
Yep.
He wrote for Jerry Lewis.
Yep.
And he wrote for Johnny Carson.
Yep.
Before he got his own gig. Isn't that amazing?
I absolutely. And the story of, and he told it on this show, I believe he told it on this show, the story of how he got the gig, with Jack Parr. It was just, it's a phenomenal story. You talk about Jack Parr and Merv Griffin. I mean, and we're going to get into that here. We talk a lot on this show about what Bill Carter lovingly referred to as the late shift, when Johnny retired and Jay showed up and Dave moved over. Conan, Arsenio was in the mix in the syndications. We can get to that in a minute here too, because there's a comparison with Merv on that. And then and among others. And that many people consider that to be the late shift. One of the reasons I'm so excited to have you on here, Steve, is this was not the first time that there was any sort of a late night war. And when Jack Parr retired, he kind of set off a chain of events that led to that generation's version of a late night war. When he called it quits, they had a bunch of guest hosts in between when Jack left and Johnny showed up. One of them, the chief one being, and what many consider to be the best one, Merv Griffin.
Merv Griffin and Jerry Lewis was the other one.
And Jerry Lewis was the other one.
And both of them got talk show contracts. Lewis got a talk show, a Saturday night talk show on ABC, and Merv went to NBC.
Yep.
And Bob Shanks, Merv Griffin's producer, told me that the reasoning behind NBC's decision was they weren't sure if Johnny was going to work out. So they wanted Merv Griffin in the bullpen to fill in case Johnny didn't work out. That was like a safety net for them.
Yep.
But I brought along a list with me that you might be interested in. Some of the interim guest hosts were Art Linkletter, Bob Cummings, Jack Carter, Jan Murray, Soupy Sales, Peter Lynn Hayes, Mort Saul, Jimmy Dean, Steve Lawrence, Arlene Francis, Jackie Leonard, Groucho Marx, Hugh Downs, Hal March, Jerry Lewis, and Merv Griffin. There were 17 guest hosts.
Was Joey Bishop as well? Was he in that list? Did I miss him?
Yes.
Oh yeah. Joey Bishop was and amazing. And how many of those guys ended up? Some of them were already well established, but how many of them ended up with shows as well? I mean, it's a big list. It's a big list.
Now, the first competition for Carson was not Merv Griffin. That would have been Les Crane on ABC. He was the guy with the microphone shotgun. I don't know if you remember him or not.
I don't.
But it was called Nightlife. And he was on at 11:30 on ABC, a tremendous failure. And then they tried all kinds of innovative things. They tried to switch cities and formats, but it was not a success. So he's a footnote in the history of late night television. The Les Crane Show. And
the Les Crane Show. So that's ABC. Merv went over to CBS, correct?
Well, Merv was on NBC. Excuse me again.
Yeah, no.
Merv was on. He started out on NBC in the daytime. At 2:00 in the afternoon. And that only lasted until April. He started in October of 62 and then ran until April of 62. Unfortunately, a nighttime show didn't play too well. At 2:00 in the afternoon. That was considered too cerebral for the daytime audience. The housewife, don't mean to sound sexist, but the housewives of America who were doing their housework and their chores, they didn't want to hear about, these eclectic subjects, or these esoteric subjects. So, and people were watching Password, which was on CBS. So that failed. And then Merv did a game show called Word for Word,
Yeah.
which enabled him to become his own producer. So when Nightlife bit the dust in 1965, ABC's next tryout was Joey Bishop from 67 to 69 with Regis Philbin as his announcer. And did you know Regis Philbin had his own talk show?
Absolutely.
And San Diego was a local, it was called That Regis Philbin Show.
Yep. And
he had Richard Nixon on. He had a lot of heavyweight people on that program.
It's so like on paper, Bishop is one of those ones that fascinates me, because on paper you'd think, like you say, Regis, who already a dynamite broadcaster as a backbone, but part of the Rat Pack. You think that Bishop is going to be a guy that has some legs with Carson. Later on, Dick Cavett, same sort of thing. I mean, a perfect example of counter programming. I think he was a really, really good alternative to Johnny. But with Merv, like you say, moving away from being maybe head to head with Johnny, similar audience, different audience. What do you think about that?
Well, it was the same audience. They were vying for the same slice of the pie at the 11:30 p.m.
At that point, yeah.
But see, what happened was after Regis failed at his syndicated talk show by Group W Westinghouse, they gave that show actually belonged to Steve Allen. It was a Steve Allen Westinghouse show that failed, and they gave that to Regis. When Regis failed, they gave it to Merv.
Yeah,
that caught on. That skyrocketed. That was from 65 to 69, and then when CBS decided that they too could demonstrate that they could have an audience in the 11:30 time period, they put Merv on opposite Carson. And that was really the first three-way talk show war. This trilogy of great shows. You had Bishop on ABC, Johnny on NBC, and Merv on CBS. And then when Bishop folded at the end of 69, that went to Cavett.
Right.
And one writer, you remember last week you had Rob
Cates. Yep, absolutely.
He held up the Newsweek magazine that had the three hosts: Bishop, Carson, and Griffin.
And Merv,
And Merv, right, exactly. So when Bishop went off the air and he was replaced by Cavett, there was one reporter in Newsweek who put it succinctly. He said, you have Carson, the funny guy, you have Merv, the homespun guy, and you have Cavett, the intellectual guy.
Yeah.
And of course, everybody went with Carson because, don't forget, NBC had a lot more stations than CBS did. NBC had something like 200 stations against Merv's 105 or 120 shows. Merv was actually seen on more stations when he was in syndication on the Westinghouse network, than when he went to CBS. So it was actually
wasn't there a point where Merv actually had shows on all three networks at the same time or something like that? Wasn't it? There was
not the same. No, not that.
It wasn't the same time, but he ended up bouncing around and ended up being on all three networks, wasn't he? He started out on NBC. Yeah.
Then he went to syndication with Westinghouse.
Yeah.
Then he went to CBS.
Yeah.
Then he went back to syndication with Metro Media.
Okay.
Right.
Gotcha. And that's where that's the longevity piece there, right? That's the one that ran and ran and ran and ran.
Now he had programs that he produced at the same time that were on all three networks, because you had Jeopardy, and Wheel of Fortune, and he had a whole litany of other game shows that he produced, some of which were just short-lived. Like Reach for the Stars and Let's Play Post Office and Joe Gallarcio's Memory Game. A lot of people don't even remember these shows today.
Yeah.
But his two big hits in the foray of game shows were Jeopardy and Wheel of Fortune.
Yeah. I mean,
and don't forget Dance Fever was also a big hit for him too.
Dance Fever, again, people right now might use Dance Fever as a punchline. That was a massive, massive show from a profit standpoint and from a reach. That was a huge show. So there are people that I try and compare Merv Griffin to, and I patiently will tell people, there was a time in like the late 80s, early 90s where Donald Trump and Merv Griffin would be constantly compared to each other as business moguls. You look at entertainment moguls, and you take a guy like Dick Clark and you put Merv Griffin beside. Like, to me, those are like, okay, these are heavyweights. But again, Merv many times just doesn't seem to get that respect that he certainly deserves. But the one thing that I would just from his forward facing image, his public comments and interviews and things like that, Merv seems to be most at home being almost a folksy entertainer, always with a joke, as opposed to the other guys who might be a little more serious.
Well, there's a difference between Carson and Griffin. Carson was essentially a comedian.
Yep.
He was the best, absolute best at what he did. No question. Merv, on the other hand, was an all-around entertainer.
Right.
Of all the talk show hosts, he was the only one who could carry a decent tune. He could sing.
Big band singer. Yeah, very successful.
He did everything,
yep.
right? And every aspect of his shows was under his thumb. He knew exactly what was going on, whereas Johnny had a tendency to delegate responsibilities to producers and talent coordinators and stage managers and things like that. Mm-hmm. Earlier today, you sent me a clip, a thing of clips of David Letterman.
Don Giller's compilation. I believe it's in Talk Show Host number 5. Yeah, I highly recommend it to everybody out there. Don Giller's compilation shows every time that Merv ever touched any late show or late night production, and it's all in one beautiful compilation. I highly recommend it. Don Giller's channel. Yeah.
Excellently done. If you look at the first segment that's on that reel of clips, Merv comes out and they played I've Got a Lovely Bunch of Coconuts, which was the number 2 song in the country in 1950. That was his novelty song. But the point what stood out to me is that he gave David Letterman a little bit of advice. He said, when you do an interview with somebody, you zero in close and you look them in the eye. And Merv had this intensity, which he gave. And then you look at some of the clips that followed when Dave got a little bit more familiar with Merv. He's much, much more laid back and relaxed. And Merv, of course, got older and older and heavier and heavier as the years went on.
Also, massive success. That guy enjoyed life.
Right. And the other thing is that if you met Merv Griffin on the street, the way I did in 1980, if you bumped into him on the street and he gave you that intense look, he looked you in the eye and he spoke to you and he treated you as though you were a guest on his show. He made you feel important, regardless of who you were or are, or anything like that. So when you walked away from having an encounter with Merv Griffin, you met a star.
Oh, that's very, very cool. The other thing about that, the reference that you're talking to, the interview, I should say, the conversation that he had with Dave, that was actually on the morning show. And yes. Merv came on there and really, and I mean, Dave had trouble with the morning show from day one. That's been well documented. We've talked about that on this show, because it's the right show being played at the wrong time, essentially, is what it was. And yet at the same time, Merv comes out there. And not only does he give Dave the props as to how good the show is, and it was a great show, just at the wrong time, but he also gave Dave advice that whether or not he was cognizant that he took it or not, it was about failure. And I loved how he talked about how failure is actually the thing that propels him forward. And you're it's that personal development adage, you're winning or you're learning kind of a thing. But he talked about how much he failed and how many of his game shows and how many of his projects did fail. And yet he moved on to becoming, probably greater than anybody ever would have thought he would have.
Well, you mentioned something that's very poignant. Merv had a personal connection to that because his show, his NBC show in the daytime, was a perfect example of what you said. It was the right show at the wrong time.
Yep.
A Tonight Show format doesn't play well at 2:00 in the afternoon.
No.
So that was a good example of that, being the right show, but in the wrong. See, Mike Douglas, he was perfect for the lunchtime crowd and the early afternoon crowd. His show was perfect for that time slot. Merv was a little bit more sophisticated. He got into edgy topics. He got into topics that normally were not discussed on daytime TV, and a lot of critics. The critics loved that show. Unfortunately, the audience didn't tune in because they were watching Password on CBS.
Well, and that's the same thing. I think they even made a game show joke when he was on the morning show there. And of course, when Dave's show was pulled from the morning, what did they fill it with? It was a block of game shows. I mean, game shows is such a huge thing. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. What's your hunch? That was his first.
Player Hunch.
Was that involved? Was that around when the quiz show scandal happened, or was that kind of made in the aftermath?
It was just after the quiz show.
It was after.
The quiz show scandal was early 50s, and Player Hunch came on in 58. Okay. Interestingly, when Merv got the idea for Jeopardy, which he actually got from his wife Julianne, she's a great lady. I love her. She gave me a very nice interview for my book. They were sitting on a plane. She and Merv were on a plane, and he was doodling on a sketch pad.
Yeah.
And she said, "What's that? Is that an idea for another show, another game?" And he said, "Yeah." He said, "I'm trying to come up with a game." And she said, "Why don't you come up with a show where you give people the answers and let them devise the questions?" And he said, "Are you crazy?" He said, "People are going to jail for that. Give people the answers." And she said, "No. Do it legitimately.
Yeah.
Tell them the answers and let it be known that this is the answer to a question." And that's how Jeopardy was born. Now, that show was originally turned down. That was rejected by Mort Warner, who was a big executive at NBC, because he thought that was too smart. The audience was not smart enough to handle a show like that.
Yep.
But it was Grant Tinker, the guy who was married to Mary Tyler Moore.
Wow.
But now, wait a minute, let's play around with this. There's some possibilities here.
Yep.
So ultimately, it got greenlit, and then it went on the air. The original title was "What's the Question?"
Are you kidding me?
No.
What's the question?
It wasn't called Jeopardy from the beginning. It was called "What's the Question?" And then they changed it to Jeopardy, and it went on the air with Art Fleming as the host in 1964. Exactly.
Huh.
Right.
Grant Tinker, also an executive who had, well, I wouldn't say run-ins, but he was one of the ones who was the executive for David Letterman for a time as well. So yeah, yeah. Talking about the game show, and I can talk all day about the connections between personalities on game shows and personalities on talk shows, and it's so funny over the years how one has bled into the other. But Merv is the guy that kind of did both. He really, I mean, Johnny started out with game shows, of course, but that is such a neat, to me,
Earn
your
vacation.
What's that?
Earn Your Vacation was Johnny's first big game show. Do you know how Merv got into talk shows?
Tell me.
Player Hunch was taped in Studio 6B at NBC.
Yes.
And Jack Parr used to cut through the studio to get to his office. And one day he came through the curtain in the middle of a show. And the audience went nuts. They went, "Oh my God, it's Jack Parr." Because at that time, Jack Parr was the big, he was the big host.
The host of The Tonight Show.
The legendary host. And he and Merv had an exchange, totally ad lib, everything off the cuff, totally extemporaneous. And the audience howled at everything they said. And then that's how Merv got to guest host for Parr on The Tonight Show.
Yeah. And
the first time he did it, he froze up. He couldn't go on the air. He said, "I can't do this." He said, "I'm leaving." And his producer, who actually it wasn't Merv's producer, he became Merv's producer. This was the guy who worked for Jack Parr.
Jack's guy. It
was Bob Shanks.
Yep.
The man who later created Good Morning America in 2020 for ABC.
Wow.
He said, "Merv, you've got to do this. You can't leave." He said, "If you walk out on this, you're going to ruin your career in television. They will never trust you again." He said, "Don't be nervous. Play to me. Make believe I'm the only person in the studio." And he did, and he was a smash.
Yeah.
This would have been April of '62. So when Parr left, no, excuse me, I'm sorry. It was January of '62. Because Parr left The Tonight Show at the end of March.
Yes.
In '62. And then from April to October, you had those 17 people that we just talked about. Right.
Because Johnny was fulfilling a commitment with another show at another network. And so
who do you trust?
There you go.
And that was originally called "Do You Trust Your Wife?" Did you know that?
I don't remember that. No, I had no idea. There's a guy I got to get you connected with named Adam Nedeff. He's a game show historian. He's been on this show and he's phenomenal. You two are going to get along as well as you and I get along, but I'm always going to be your favorite.
What I was going to say is, here's a little bit of Tonight Show trivia for you. Yeah. Who was the first woman to guest host The Tonight Show? Do you know that?
It's not Joan.
Oh God, Joan probably wasn't even anywhere near the business.
No,
this goes back to 1956. See, because Steve Allen used to alternate with Ernie Kovacs for him. And one night he couldn't make it. And the first woman who guest hosted The Tonight Show was Betty White.
Oh, that's right. I did know that. Yes.
And then during
absolutely.
During the Parr era in 1959, Arlene Francis filled in for Jack Parr in 59. You remember? You're old enough to remember What's My Line?
I know What's My Line. Absolutely. Okay.
Your game show guy would know that.
Oh, Adam, absolutely. Yeah, Adam, he knows everything. He's got four. You've got 4 books out, or you're working on your fourth.
Three.
Your fourth one you're working on. I think he's got 4 or 5. He just released the Gong Show book, and there's other ones that he has done, biographies on hosts and things like that. He is absolutely enamored with reporting. Yes, sir. What do you got there?
You know something? I was looking at my Amazon reviews today, and at the bottom of the Amazon page, my Penny Singleton book, Penny Singleton, who played Blondie,
Yeah.
I did her biography. It said people who have bought this book frequently look and buy this book, and it was the Gong Show book.
There you
that you're
go.
talking about,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. You and Adam are gonna become fast friends. Absolutely. So Johnny and Merv.
Right.
I want to talk about their dynamic for a second,
Yeah.
because again, you have these people in this very unique. I don't know if something can be very unique. I think unique is just a state of whatever, but
It's just unique. Yeah, right.
it's
There's no qualifier for it. Yeah.
yeah, you don't need the qualifier. It doesn't
It's
work.
strange you should mention that. I was looking at a Tomorrow Show interview with Johnny Carson and Tom Snyder.
Yep.
Johnny said very unique, and then he corrected himself. He said, "Oh no," he said, "that's wrong." He said, "There's no qualifier. It's not very unique. It's just unique." Because Tom Snyder asked him, he said, "Did you want to be unique following unique because Jack Parr was unique?"
Yeah.
And Johnny said, "No, I didn't want to be unique following unique." He said, "That never works in show business."
Yeah.
He wanted to be his own man, which is
yeah.
what he did.
Yeah, absolutely.
The dynamic of Carson and Griffin, you were saying.
Yeah, no, you were just, you know what? We'll come back to what you were just going down. Yeah, the dynamic with Carson and Griffin, because I mean, this situation where you have these talk show hosts, there aren't very many of them. It's blazing a trail in many ways, extremely profitable for the network if they can make it work. And many times there have been attitudes where there's conflict. Right now, the 4 or 5 or 6 late night hosts get along very well. During the writer's strike,
Yeah.
they released a podcast together. They're the Strike Force 5. But it wasn't like that. Of course, famously, Dave and Jay, that behavior, which fractured their dynamic. You go back and you've heard like Jack or not Jack, Johnny and Dick Cavett, for a while there. But Merv and Johnny never really had. They always got along pretty well, didn't they?
Well, there was a bit of a rivalry at the beginning in '62.
Yeah,
because they were vying for the same guests.
Yep.
You see, you got to understand, Merv was a motion picture actor before he got into television. So a lot of the top directors, a lot of the big movie stars, people like Elizabeth Taylor and Judy Garland, they knew Merv Griffin. Johnny was a game show host who was on the daytime, so he didn't have the stature in 1962 that he would have a decade later,
right,
when he was the biggest star in the world, the biggest star in the history of the medium.
Yep.
So a lot of people would go on with Merv, and they didn't, not that they didn't like Johnny, they didn't trust him because they didn't, they were not too familiar with him.
Yep.
So there was a time when there was a comedian by the name of, I can't remember his name now. Shaughnessy, Mickey Shaughnessy. Yep. He went on the Tonight Show and he mentioned Merv Griffin. They bleeped out the name Merv Griffin.
Yep.
Even though they were on the same network, they were both talk show hosts on the same channel.
Yep.
They thought that this was undue a plug for a competitor.
And this is all the way back in 1962. Years, like what you're describing, right, for people in my generation who love this stuff but never got a chance to go back and understand or haven't read the Carter books or some of the other books that have come out. That is that's the exact behavior that we saw. And it's funny how that is sort of a timeless thing. The idea of when you have the guest in the chair and they are a television star, but for a show on another network, that's what you're saying. You know what? This person can be seen in MASH on another network. And that's the verbiage they would use. And the behavior that you're talking about, bleeping out, that person's like, it's astounding.
Right.
It's timeless. It's something that's always been there.
We're not talking about uniqueness. You got to realize that the talk show genre is something that is unique to television because this is a format that was never done in any form. Getting 5 or 6 people together and putting them on a stage,
yep,
and having them converse, having them interact, and having them perform, totally ad-libbed, off the cuff. That was something that was never done in radio. It was never done in the theater. So this is a format that is unique to the television medium.
Yep.
And the talk shows are important, in my view, and I'm sure you'll agree, because they're little miniature time capsules.
Yes.
Of our culture at the time. You look at some of the Carson clips. There's one Carson clip where he comes out and he's dressed as Shirley Temple.
Yep.
And he's singing on the Good Ship Lollipop. That's because Shirley Temple had announced that she was running for Congress. This was in the mid-'60s.
Yeah.
So a clip like that speaks volumes of what was happening in the news at that time,
Yeah.
And, you look at some of the talk shows where certain themes, certain things that fads, the streaker on The Tonight Show, for example, when streaking,
Yeah.
it was Pat McCormick came out and he streaked across the Tonight Show stage. Probably grossed everybody out, but that spoke volumes of what was, the fad at that time, what was happening in our culture.
And not just the time capsule for just the show itself, but you think about it, there's 3 or 4 mini time capsules per episode, because you have the monologue, of course, which many times, of course, is taking shots at leadership or events of the day. You'd have musical acts who,
Right.
Of course, show the taste and whatnot. Never mind the comedy pieces, and never mind, of course, the subjects discussed during panel. And you're right that it is a unique to television, and I would even submit like terrestrial television, not streaming. I don't think it is terrestrial. Darn it. Anyway, classic TV as opposed to streaming.
Sure.
I mean, Netflix has Amazon. They've been trying to figure out how to nail a daily show, and they can't really do it yet. And I think it's because, they're getting into sports. Netflix and streaming is getting into sports. I think they're going to do very well at that. It's the appointment that needs to be kept, no matter if it's on network TV or streaming TV. But talk shows at the end of the day have been appointment television, like network television, not even just network, I guess. There's a lot of cities around in North America that have a localized version of one of these talk shows. It's penetrated the culture to such a deep level. And you're right, it's just specific basically to television.
Television, right, exactly. See, and these guys like Carson and Griffin, they were captivating. You tuned it, you wanted them in your living room, and they were very, very good at what they did. And talk about the dynamic between Carson and Griffin. Aside from being game show hosts and talk show hosts and, wealthy guys who had these multi-million-dollar contracts, they had one other thing in common. They both loved tennis.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Merv Griffin's uncle Elmer was one of the, preeminent tennis champions, and Johnny loved tennis. But why is it that they never got on a tennis court and played a few sets? I don't know why that never happened. I'd pay money to see that. I mean,
you got to wonder how hard that they would go at it. Would it be leisurely or Johnny was a fierce competitor. He was a fierce competitor. Right. Anybody who came at him, probably because he made his bones, it wasn't a certainty that he would keep the show. And over the years, he learned how to protect himself in ways that are just, championship like mentality. You watch The Last Dance with Michael Jordan and you think a lot of these people, they think at that level, they compete at that level. You got to wonder if those two played each other, how hard they would go. Part of me thinks that Johnny would let loose as much as he could.
Well, I don't think Merv was the type of guy who would acquiesce, who would give in and let Johnny. He probably would have given him a run for his money. And Merv really didn't have anything to lose because, at that point, they were not against each other anymore. If you look at Merv's first appearance on The Carson Show, which aired the night that Merv aired his last episode, September 86, the two of them, now that they didn't have to compete for guests or ratings, they were going at it with ad libs. They were trying to top each other in the joke department. It was sort of like, can you top this? And it's hilarious.
Is that clip out there?
It's on YouTube. Yeah.
So Merv Griffin's appearance on the Tonight Show simultaneous to the day of his last show. That's the dream match in the talk show world. This is a month before Dave retired. I had a conversation with him at Q&A. One of the questions I asked him is Leno going to be on the show in the next month? This is a month before he retired. And he brought a producer out, Nancy, shout out to Nancy. And they were talking about it, and it was a big deal. Like, everybody was talking about this. Would Jay appear on Dave's show, and it never happened. But that's kind of one of those moments where, if Jay, when he retired at the last night of his Tonight Show, if he would have come over and sat down on the Ed Sullivan Theater and talked to Dave that same night, that is a very interesting dynamic. Right. Was there any special setting up that, or was it set up very easily?
There was a difference in the old days when Merv went back to syndication in 1972 after he left CBS.
Yeah.
I think within the first month that he was on Metro Media, guess who one of his surprise guests was?
Yeah.
Johnny Carson.
Yeah.
And it was a surprise. It was planned, of course. I mean, they knew he was going to do
Sure.
it. What they did, they had Doc Severinsen on as a guest.
Yeah.
And Dick Carson was Merv's director.
There we go. For a bunch of different projects too, right? Like they worked together. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then who walked out but Johnny? And that show it's iconic. It's worth its weight in gold. It's the fact that you have these two great guys. If you look at Merv's autobiography, he has a photograph in his book where he's got a picture from a still photograph from that appearance that he made on Merv's show in 1972. This, by the way, this is my signed copy that I got from Merv when I met him the first time, and he put the date on it. It's from September 18th, 1980. 50.
Wow.
No, 44 years ago, right? A little over 44 years.
If there's a fire, is that one of the things you're grabbing?
There are too many things around here.
Me too, brother. Me too. I got so many of them.
Sort of like a museum around here.
Yeah, me too.
How many people have how many people collect talk show memorabilia? I mean, that's kind of
It's true. I got a lot of great pieces around me, and I feel like almost an energy from it. Like that's one of Dave's bridges. I mean, I love that stuff, and I know that you've got a bunch of stuff there. We'll talk about that, but let's go to books here for a second. Actually, before we go to books, just to kind of add to what you were saying, if there was a question that I would like a meaningless question, a talk show nerd question that I would ask Johnny Carson, one of the contenders would be, you really seem to enjoy doing a nice walk on somewhere. He did it on Letterman a couple of times on both incarnations of the show. In fact, his last time we saw him on TV was he did a walk on to Late Show when they did a run in California. And Johnny just seemed so tickled every time he would come onto screen and surprise people. It's like the standing ovation he would get every single night wasn't enough, but it was a surprise appearance. The standing ovation is going to be even that much bigger. Like it was a different energy. He loved the walk on. Did Merv as well? That's my question.
Oh, sure. God, yeah. Merv was on Steve Allen's syndicated show. He was on, as you mentioned, David Letterman.
Yeah.
He was on a few others that escape my mind.
Did Oprah ever give Merv did Merv ever get the Oprah treatment? I don't even know if I saw that when I was researching.
I think Oprah was on Merv. I don't think Merv was on Oprah. I'm not really.
Yeah, that's probably that's probably right.
But Johnny was no stranger to other people's programs. He was on with David Frost. He was on with Dinah Shore.
60 Minutes.
He was on with Phil Donahue.
Yeah. Absolutely.
He was on with Merv. I mean, he was on with David Letterman.
Walters and 60 Minutes too, from the news side of things, right?
Well, those were a different kind of appearances. So those were kind of the in-depth, the Barbara Walters things on ABC. That was sort of like an in-depth thing. I'm talking about the variety type of format, where you're in front of a live audience and you come out and you sit down and it's more relaxed. Yeah. Another thing, talking about being more relaxed, you look at the shows today.
Yeah.
They're very, they're like chopped up into 10-minute segments. You look at a talk show from the 60s, they go on and on for like 15 and 20 minutes before they break for a commercial. Today, somebody comes on, they plug whatever book they have or record or movie they have, and then they're gone. Next person comes on. It wasn't like that. Back in the old days, you had 4, 5, 6 people sitting, on a set, all conversing, and it was sort of like a cocktail party. Where people were gathering, and you put together people who normally wouldn't be comfortable with each other, and then you hope that sparks fly, because that's what makes for good television. So
here's my question. I mean, right now you just nailed the formula perfectly. It's so formulaic. And then you look at what Dave's doing, and I mean, I don't know if you've seen very much of My Next Guest Needs No Introduction on Netflix. It's his long form. Dave, this is me. I've always said this is him playing Tom Snyder. And doing the long form thing. And I think that's where the puck is going. The biggest show in the world is Joe Rogan. The average episode is over 3 hours long form, deep into conversation, no commercials at all, and substance rather than, the steak rather than the sizzle. Do you think Merv would have done well in a long form environment? Or do you think he fed off the audience? He was kind of that classic entertainer,
Yes.
a bridge from yesteryear into, that live audience. It felt like that was his element to me.
That was when he was in his element, but I think he could have tackled anything. I think he would have adapted to whatever medium, he was thrust into.
Yeah.
But he was a genius, and he certainly did well for himself. And you don't see guys they don't make them like that anymore. They just don't. I mean, I like Stephen Colbert, and I like Jimmy Kimmel. I watch them. I kind of switch back and forth depending upon who they have on.
Those are my two as well.
Yeah. But I think when you look at all the classic, Steve Allen, Jack Parr, Johnny Carson, Merv Griffin, I think David Letterman is really the only one who fits into that classic mold. He's cut from that same mold. And a lot of the guys, they're doing their own thing. Of course, they're very political.
Yeah.
Johnny got political. He took a pot shot at whoever was in power, but he never really took sides.
Neither did Merv, right?
Anything as toxic, as it is today.
Same with Merv in that regard, right? That's a similarity.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Merv had all the great politicians on his show. He had Nixon.
Yeah.
He had Jimmy Carter. He had Gerald Ford. In fact, Merv was the first talk show host to do an appearance with a sitting president in the White House in 1981 when Ronald Reagan was in office.
Oh, there you go. Is that clip online? I got to see that clip. I haven't seen that one. I got to find that one. That's got to be out there.
It's on one of the DVD sets. Merv is very friendly with Nancy Reagan. So I'm sure that's how that came about, how that was orchestrated. But he did, he went to the White House, and a very, very good interview. And of course, the Democrats, they kind of objected to the fact that they were giving a Republican a whole hour of airtime without any rebuttal. But they didn't get too political. I mean, it wasn't anything. They talked about what was happening in the news, and they talked about their lives and the direction that the country was going. And it was a very, very nice, pleasant, generic form of enjoyable interview. There wasn't anything.
Were they actors at the same time? Merv and President Reagan?
No. Merv got into motion pictures through Doris Day.
Yeah.
Because he was a big band singer.
Yeah.
Doris Day caught his nightclub act in Vegas.
Right.
And she recommended him to William Orr, who was one of the big heads at Warner Brothers. So they got him under contract to Warner Brothers, and he's in a movie with Doris Day, By the Light of the Silvery Moon.
Yes.
And then he did a whole slew of other things. He didn't like movies. The idea of sitting around waiting for the director to yell,
Right.
Right.
But
Reagan, the spontaneity of a live audience.
Right. And it makes sense that he would have transitioned over just like Johnny did. I mean,
right.
they were instinctually moving towards their true calling,
right.
With some pit stops along the way. But like, is it the same time frame that Reagan, would they have gone to the Oscars together and been in the audience together at the same time? Like, was it a similar? Because they would have. My point is him going to the White House. They would maybe connect with broadcaster and president, but also they're also kind of from the same business in a similar time.
Well, Reagan was a contract player at Warner Brothers in the 30s.
Yeah.
From the late 30s and into the 40s.
Gotcha.
And then in the 50s, Reagan got into television. He was the host of Death Valley Days.
Yes.
Then, he was the president of the Screen Actors Guild, and that was his foray into politics,
into administration work.
That got him into the political arena, and then he became governor. He served 2 terms served 2 terms as governor of California. I think it was 1966 to 74 or something like that. And then he began making a run for the White House, which he ultimately got, in 1980. Right. But I don't think they were at Warner Brothers at the same time.
I got you. No. But the same business. And I mean, yeah, it's probably more like an older brother, even father, heavens, situation, but the same business. Did Merv ever have any political aspirations?
No, I don't think so. But you know what? He would have been great because being the president is sort of like being the head of a big company, a big corporation. One of Merv's producers, when I was interviewing people for my book, said that if you were stranded on an island or you were stranded out in the middle of the ocean in a boat, Merv Griffin would be the guy that you would want to be stranded with because he would figure out a way to get you to safety. He was a very, very innovative guy. He could think out any type of his credo was if something isn't broke, fix it anyway. He was very, very good at solving. He liked to solve problems.
Yeah.
And he said Merv Griffin would be the guy you'd want to be adrift with, because he'd figure out a way to save you.
I was going to get into this before. I'll get into it now, because I mean, yeah, and we'll get into his business acumen and what people just don't realize. Like imagine an extremely clever genius level performer, combined, kind and nice and the good that you would think, with the reputation and the acumen and the net worth of a Donald Trump now. Very different personality, but there's some similarities there. Like his acumen is top shelf. Now the biography you held up before, compared to your book, and I want to talk about your book. So that book was released in what, 1980, you said?
Merv wrote 3 autobiographies. This was his principal volume of autobiography.
The one you held up is the one.
That's this one.
Yep.
Right. Okay.
Yep.
And he did another one that focused on his favorite guests. It was called From Where I Sit.
Mm-hmm.
And then his final book was Making the Good Life Last, and that goes up to and including 2000.
Okay.
So that was his years covering his career and his years in retirement, and traveling around the world. He had a yacht, he had property all over the world. Now,
right.
Merv was on the front page of the business papers when he did the deal with Donald Trump.
Yeah,
he purchased Resorts International in Atlantic City and some property in the Bahamas, which made the front page of. In fact, I went down to see him at the resorts twice. And we saw him, my friend and I saw him, and he came over to our table and sat with us and talked with us. And he picked up our dinner tab.
Oh, that is a great story.
Right.
Dave, are you listening?
Dave?
He picked up his dinner tab. What are we going to do here? Never mind.
Well, I gave him a gift. I have to point out that I gave him a gift. I had a VHS tape of a rare program that he had been on. It was a kinescope.
Yeah.
It was for the video. And he was like a kid in a candy store. He was like, they would say Merv went ooh and ah.
How good does that feel? How good does that feel? Is that not the greatest feeling in the world, that you can kind of give something back to this person that has affected you so much that you could actually say here and it actually have meaning to them? That is an incredible feeling.
It was actually, the way it happened was kind of funny. My friend and I, Merv was appearing at Resorts, which he owned at the time, and his opening act was Margaret Whiting, who was a great singer. Her father was Richard Whiting. And my friend and I tried to get backstage to see Merv, because my buddy was a big fan of Margaret Whiting and I was a big fan of Merv. And we couldn't get in. They wouldn't let us backstage to see him. And I said, but I know. They said, oh, of course you know him. Everybody knows him. Everybody knows Merv Griffin. But what happened was, at 1 o'clock in the morning, when we're sitting in the restaurant, this was 4th of July weekend, 1992.
Yeah.
Who walks in but Merv Griffin? Now, I had been on the Variety Club telethon with him a couple of years earlier. So I waved to him and I said, John, wipe your mouth. I said, here comes Merv. He didn't believe me. I said, he's coming closer. Wipe your mouth. And Merv comes over and he slaps us on the back. Hi, guys, how you doing? And he couldn't have been nicer. So
that is amazing.
I gave him this gift and we talked. We took pictures with him and we chatted. We talked about the main topic of conversation on that occasion was his lost episodes on CBS, because they didn't save a lot of his CBS shows.
Yep.
They have a lot of the Westinghouse shows, but very, very few, maybe a handful of the CBS shows. So we talked about that. And then when it came time to pay the bill, the waiter said, he goes, you're taken care of. And I said, what do you mean? What do you mean by that? He goes, because the boss picked up your tab.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
What kind of a show did he put on? You went and saw him live?
It was a musical show. He sang.
Yeah.
Sort of like a coconut ballroom type format thing. And he was a big band singer. And he sang a lot of his hits. And he sang a couple of songs that he had written himself. One was I'm a Big Band Singer. It was a song that Merv had composed himself. He performed that. Yeah. And there were other people on the program as well. But it was a nice night. We didn't get home until like 4:30 in the morning.
You know what I think about sometimes is the idea of I think about some of these guys or gals, as the case may be, doing a run of some sort on Broadway. Yeah. And it compels me like crazy. Like like as opposed to a residency in Las Vegas, which I guess has its own you know, as well, of course. But like a run on Broadway, I could see a Merv Griffin doing some sort of a run on Broadway
Well, he was
of
on
a
Broadway.
variety show.
In 1955, he was in Finian's Rainbow.
Okay, so he did it
Broadway.
before. I'm
But
talking, but as Merv Griffin, as the personality that he kind of became after all of this stuff.
This is before he became.
That's right. Yeah.
Now, Johnny Carson. Here's another similarity between Carson and Griffin. Carson was also on Broadway. He was in Tunnel of Love, which was a Broadway show, and then Johnny was in a film with Connie Francis called Looking for Love. And Johnny said, and he said this many times on the air. He said it was a film that was so bad that they transferred it to flammable nitrate stock. Normally films to preserve them, they transfer them to the safety stock.
Yeah.
He said this was so bad they transferred it to nitrate stock, so it would disintegrate.
That's such a clever joke.
Right.
And it's like
Merv was on Broadway though. He was again, that wasn't his thing. He had a radio show. The first Merv Griffin show was actually a musical radio show on ABC.
Yeah.
That was 57. And then the following year is when he got, and there was a time when he was around the dials. You turn on the station, the various channels at any time of the day. And Merv Griffin, he was on Keep Talking. He was on Play Your Hunch. He was on The Tonight Show. Yep. He was on, I'm probably leaving out a whole lot of shows where he was either pitching for somebody who was sick or he was, vying for a job. But ultimately he got Play Your Hunch, and that was a Goodson Todman game show. Yep. There's an episode of To Tell the Truth, which is one of the classic Goodson Todman game shows. It's from 1961. And Merv was under contract to them because he was doing Play Your Hunch. Well, Merv was filling in for the vacationing Bud Collyer, who was the original host of To Tell the Truth. And on the panel is a young Johnny Carson.
Oh, my gosh.
1961, before they started their respective talk shows. The Game Show channel runs that from time to time. If you ever get a chance to see it, watch it, because it's interesting to see Johnny. He looks like he's a 12-year-old kid, and Merv is all bright and bubbly, and everybody has dark hair, and they're skinny and young and full of energy and very enthusiastic.
Johnny was just a step away from being the great Carsoni at that point. Right. I mean, that's early on.
Well, he was still doing Do You Trust Your Wife?
Right.
On ABC.
Right.
This is 61.
Yeah.
Right.
Man. So talk about where your book fits into all of this.
Well,
Let's see your book and when did it come out?
This came out about 6 or 7 years ago. This is called Merv Griffin Show, The Inside Story. This is a comprehensive review of the show. It's not a biography of Merv Griffin.
Yeah. There's a big difference there. Right. Yeah. Exactly. It's a deep dive.
I thought that the show was interesting enough to warrant a book of this size. And it's like 428 pages. It's not a slender volume.
How did you write it? Was it clinical, or did you write it like a thriller?
No, my original concept was to do a book of all the talk show hosts, sort of like an encyclopedia of everybody.
Take my money. No. Steve, if we can figure that out, I will be part of that however necessary, and I will gather forces. That is a great idea.
And then I discovered that somebody had already done it. Somebody had already beat me to it. There's a book called Let's Talk by Robert Parrish.
Yes.
And David Letterman is in there, and Merv Griffin, and Johnny Carson, and Mike Douglas, and Phil Donahue, and Oprah Winfrey, and Whoopi Goldberg. And
talk about a time capsule. What a perfect time capsule that book is. Yep.
So I met a guy who we later became good friends, and that was Albert Fisher, who was Merv's publicist during the Westinghouse period from 65 to 69.
Yeah.
And I was at his house one day, and I was looking through his archives, and he's had this tremendous collection of hundreds and hundreds of fantastic still photographs, because he photographed every guest that was on that show.
Yes.
So on the plane ride home, I said, something? I said, I just got a tremendous idea. Why not do the whole book? Since the Merv Griffin Show is my number one passion in this whole thing, why not do the whole book about Griffin? Yep. Make it all about the Merv Griffin Show.
Yep.
So I started that, and then as they were doing the DVD set, I wrote the booklet notes for the Merv Griffin Show, the 12-disc set of DVDs that came out in 2014, and I wrote the booklet notes for that. So a lot of the people that I interviewed, I was able to incorporate that into the notes, into the liner notes for that project. And then the book came along. But I got to meet and befriend a lot of people who worked for Merv. And his producer said to me one day, he said, "You love Merv so much." He said, "Why the hell didn't you work for him?" He said, "You would have been a great pre-show interviewer or a great researcher or somebody, working in that capacity," which I would have loved, but
you know what? This
I
is
would
where
have
this
loved
is
doing
something,
that.
Steve, this is something that you and I are like really similar in. I've been
Yeah.
told the same thing recently, by multiple Letterman staffers, and for me, there's absolutely no greater compliment
Compliment.
that, and that's how I certainly feel. I can't imagine it's any different for you, and that's something that kind of we share, and that's why you write that book. That's why we do this show. I say that almost every single week. This is why we do the show. You are 100% showing why we do the show through your own beautiful story. That is fantastic, man.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah. It was fun to do it. And it was sort of like a journey. And it was a journey that I enjoyed very much because I got to meet a lot of fascinating people.
Yeah.
And, I got to interview Merv's ex-wife, who was very, very nice to talk to. It was a very friendly divorce, by the way. They remained good friends.
By the way, Johnny Carson also married to a girl named Joanne who had a very similar dynamic.
Well, Johnny, it used to be a joke in show business that Johnny, he conjugated the name Jody, Joan, Joanna, and then he conjugated
it
with
like
Alexa,
a verb.
Alexis, right? Exactly.
Okay, we had to cut it there. It's a two-parter, folks. Yeah. I don't know if the two-parter is a good idea or if we should just do one huge hunk, but I'll tell you this, a lot of the prospective guests are saying, "Oh, maybe we do it after the holidays or whatever." So you know what? I'll take a two-parter. I'll take it. Takes the pressure off a little bit, but we do have some good things coming up. But anyway, just as you can see, A Brother from Another Mother, Steve is just amazing. Snag his book, Merv Griffin, The Inside Story, Steve Randisi. Just fantastic stuff. This has been another episode of the Letterman podcast with Mike Chisholm. Coincidentally, I'm Mike Chisholm. Thanks and good night. Thank you and good night.
Overcoat and underpants.